All right, now that we've kind of gotten the, idea here, let's kind of learn some new tools to help us fine tune our animation. So I think I deleted it, unfortunately, but from here to here, it's like, okay, every single time we drew something, we had to, redraw it, right? So it's like, okay, we have this, and then I come in and I try to draw something that's a little too big. It's too small. This one's just right. Something like that. Boom, boom, boom. That's totally off, but you get the idea, right? But the point is like I had to redraw every time. Every frame I had to redraw it, right? And that can be a little time consuming. And to be perfectly honest, we don't always need to change everything. Sometimes we just need to change some parts of the next drawing, not the whole drawing. So in other words, like instead of having to redraw this whole thing, what if I could keep part of this and then just redraw the parts that need to be changed? Okay. And that's kind of what the idea of a insert keyframe versus an insert blank keyframe. Okay. So here on frame 1, this is a keyframe. Okay, this black dot. So in Animate, a keyframe is where change occurs. Okay. Now, in the first couple example, we literally changed every single frame. So it's like frame 1, frame 2, frame 3, frame 4, because the snake was constantly changing. We had to constantly keep making new, keyframes. But we don't always have to do that. So here in frame 1 or keyframe 1, you can see I have this head of this character. I'm going to go to frame 5, and instead of doing an insert blank keyframe, I'm going to do a keyframe. Okay. Now what happens is when you do that, it copies whatever was in keyframe, the last keyframe, and then it brings it to your new keyframe. So in other words, like, I had a head and some ears in my first keyframe. I copied it. It now goes into the new keyframe. Okay. Then the idea is, well, now that I have this, why don't we, go ahead and make some changes to it. So I can come in here and, maybe I'll draw some eyes or something. Okay. So keyframe 1, keyframe 2. I only had to change the part I had to change. I didn't have to redraw the other elements. Okay. I'm going to go to frame 10, insert, timeline, keyframe. Okay. Keyboard shortcut for this, by the way, is F6 on your keyboard. I don't have function keys on mine, but you could do it that way too. So now what happened is I copied what was in keyframe, the second keyframe on frame 5, and it got brought to, frame 10, which is now my third keyframe. Now I can change that. I'm just going to draw some hair on it. All right. So keyframe 1, keyframe 2, keyframe 3. Okay. You can see that as each one goes on, it copies or it keeps whatever was in the last one. Let's go to frame 15. I'm just going to right click, insert keyframe. That copies that in. Now I'm going to add a mouth. Let's fill that in. Oops. Oh, because that was I think I accidentally made this a drawing object. Yeah. All right. Okay, keyframe 1, keyframe 2, keyframe 3, keyframe 4. Let's go here. So you can see, you know, if I had something really complicated, like for instance, maybe, you know, the character's just waving his arm, instead of having to redraw the whole body, I could just, you know, change the arm part, you know, which would be a lot less work. Okay. You got to think about what can save you some time here. So I'm just going to add this beard. So, you know, here I'm using keyframes to copy and add. I can also subtract stuff too. So if I go here, I'm going to once again, let's insert keyframe and let's just start deleting stuff. So I'm going to use the eraser tool. Kind of just start to delete stuff here. Oops. I think here's a drawing object. There we go. Oh, because I have there we go, erase normal. There we go. Go here, insert keyframe. All right, play back my animation. Okay, there you go. That is using keyframe. So a blank keyframe adds an entirely blank new place to draw. Insert keyframe copies what was in the last keyframe and then brings it to, creates a new page, so to speak, and then automatically copies it. Okay. All right, let's talk a little bit about frame rate. Okay. So frame rate, we talked about this a little bit last week, is the number of frames per second. Okay. This is sometimes referred to as FPS, frames per second. Okay. So, and you know, we kind of mentioned that there are sort of standardized frame rates. Let's say, you know, I mentioned how film was 24 frames per second. US television is typically 30 frames per second, whereas European TV is 5 frames per second, things like that. I'm going to play this back. So currently, this is I have 48 frames, okay? And my frame rate is 24 frames per second. And let's just play this back. You can see my character walk as it's doing there. What I want to do is I'm going to change the frame rate, okay? So I'm going to go to you can do it here or be more official. I'm just going to go back to the document. Let's change the frame rate, okay? Let's change the frame rate to be, instead of 24 frames per second, let's make it 12 frames per second, okay? And let's play back my animation. And when I do that, notice that the number of frames stayed the same, but what happened was the speed that my animation plays back, the speed of the character slowed down, okay? Now, why did that happen, okay? Why did that happen? And the answer really is physics. And the answer really is speed, okay? In physics, speed is defined as distance divided by time. So in other words, if you go 100 miles an hour, you know, if you go a distance of 100 miles and you did it in 2 hours, then your speed was 50 miles per hour, right? How does that relate to what our character did? Well, the distance is what your character is doing, the action, walking, running, you know. It can literally be the number of pixels from one side to the other. In this case, the character is just kind of staying in place, but it's doing a particular action. Okay. Um, there's really no way to measure this fairly, but let's just call it like 100 units, okay, is the distance that it's moving. Now, the first time we had a frame rate of 24 frames per second, okay? Let's do out the math real quick. If you have 48 frames total, which is what I have, and you have a frame rate of 24 frames per second, divide that by the frame rate, you have 2 seconds, 2 seconds of animation, okay? So you took the distance that it went and you divided it by, in this case, 2 seconds. Okay, this is the original one. So it went 50 units per second, give or take, okay? Hopefully this is kind of making sense. Now, in my last one, what I did was we changed the frame rate. Okay, so the distance the character went stayed the same. It stayed at 100 units. But we changed the frame rate from 24 to 12. So we had a total number of 48 frames. That didn't change, but we changed how many we need for 1 second of animation. So if I take 48, which is the total, divided by 12, my animation now was 4 seconds long, whereas before it was 2 seconds long, okay? So instead of dividing the distance by 2 seconds, we're now dividing it by 4. Well, when you divide by a higher number, you get a smaller amount. So now my thing is only moving 25 units per second, as opposed to moving 50 units per second. Now, I know this seems a bit weird, but if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, okay? If you go 100 miles in 1 hour, and then you go the same 100 miles, but now you have 2 hours, well, you don't have to go as fast, right? If you can go slower because you have more time to accomplish the same action. And that's what happened here. It's like by giving it more time, the character doesn't have to do the action as fast, and so therefore it runs slower, as shown here. What I'm going to do now is why don't we go back and let's edit that frame rate again, and this time I'm going to make the frame rate 48. Okay. So in other words, there's going to be 48 frames for every 1 second of animation. Let's play this back. And now my character is going to go hyperspeed. Why is the character, going so fast? Well, let's think about it. The character is still going 100 units. That hasn't changed. But what's changed is before, there's still only 48 frames. And let's divide that by a frame rate of 48 because we've now said, okay, there's 48 frames per second. So really, our animation is only going to last 1 second long. 100 divided by 1 is 100 units per second. Or in other words, it's a higher speed. Once again, let's think about this. If you take 2 hours to go 100 miles, that you're going 50 miles per hour, right? But now if you only have 1 hour to go that 100 miles, there's no way you can do it in 2 hours. There's no way you can do it in your original speed because you wouldn't go, you're just not as fast. You'd have to speed up, right? And that's what's happening here. You can see that my animation went from 4 seconds to 1 second, but it's still doing the same action. So the only way for it to do that is to basically go faster than it ever went. And that's why it goes much faster. So what is the point of all of this? Well, the point is that if you're going to change your frame rate, which you can do, but if you do that, it's going to speed up or slow down your animation, okay? So if you set up your animation to be 24 frames per second, but then decide later you're going to change it to 30 frames because you're trying to output it for TV, what's going to happen is it's going to speed up the animation a little bit. Okay, maybe not super noticeable, but it will a little bit. So you're going to have to, keep that in mind. Same thing if you went from 30 to 24, it would actually slow down the actions that are happening a little bit. Okay. All right, so let's go here. I have this, I'm going to play this animation back. Now, right now, as soon as I hit play, my characters, the bunny, the earth, and the flower, immediately disappear, right? Why does that happen? Well, it happens because each character is only about 1 frame long. My frame rate is 12 frames per second. So if you do out the math, each picture is only going to last about a 12th of a second, which is not particularly very long. Okay. Now, I could do something like we did here and just kind of keep, animating the character over and over. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, I don't want to change the character. I don't want it to move or alter. I just want it to stay on screen longer. Okay, so what can I do? Well, what I could do is, instead of adding a keyframe or a blank keyframe, I could just add what's called a frame. If I go to Insert Timeline Frame, keyboard shortcut is F5. It looks like I can also use A too. That's new. Okay. So you can use the letter A in your keyboard too. At least I can. I think maybe I set that using that might be my own hotkey there that I set up. But anyway, you can see that this is now lasting longer. Okay, it's now lasting 10 frames. So when I play back my animation, the Earth stays on screen about a second before it disappears. Okay. Let's do this with the bunny. I'm gonna set this up to, I'm gonna click on about frame 24 here. Once again, insert timeline frame or F5. And so now when I play this back, the earth is gonna, or the flowers are gonna disappear, then the earth, and then the bunny. So when you look at this, you'll notice that there's like the gray part, and then there's kind of this blank area. And it can get a little confusing, but the way I like to think of it is, when you have a layer and you have some sort of gray area like this, imagine this is the stage, or it's called the stage. Think of it like a puppet stage. I don't know if you like a hand puppet, like there's like a little stage for like a puppet show. And then imagine anytime your time marker goes through an area that is gray, that means that that particular character is visible, right? So it's like, it starts on frame 1, all the characters are visible, but then on frame 2, the flower is not there, so it immediately comes down, but the earth and the bunny are still there, so it's visible. But then at frame 11, the earth is no longer on, and so it gets pulled down. And then, eventually, so does the bunny. Okay. So we're just extending the length of things. I'm going to take this. Let's do the same thing. Insert frame. So, and you can actually move these two. They don't always have to, start on the first frame. So what I'm going to do is, you can actually double click to highlight, or hold down the shift key to select a range and highlight. When it turns blue, that means you can move it. And if you use the selection tool, I can move this around, and I'm actually going to move this so it starts on frame 25. So essentially what's going to happen is, the Earth's going to start on frame 1, drop out at 11. The bunny starts on frame 1, drops out at 24, and then the flower starts on frame 25 and it drops out on frame 35. Okay. By the way, if you want to remove frames, you can highlight and hold down Shift to select a range. If I want to remove my frames, I can go to Edit, Timeline, Remove Frames, or Shift F5. That would delete those. If I feel like I've added too much, you can always remove them as such. So you can either go, I'm just right-clicking Remove Frames, or you can go under Edit, Timeline, Remove, or Shift F5 would be the keyboard shortcut. Another thing about inserting a frame is you can insert them to extend the length of a keyframe so that the action doesn't run as fast. So unfortunately, I kind of messed it up here, but like, in this action, I'm just going to do this real quick, just so I have something to show you. All right. All right, there's my animation. So if I play this back, let me just create a range real quick. So my character is moving kind of fast right now. I mentioned before, one thing I could do is probably try to add, if I decided to I could add a keyframe between here and here. So I could take these, move them down, and then try to add a new one. And then sort of, oops. Try to add something between to kind of bridge that gap. But another way to do this without, that's kind of a pain and it's a lot of work, is I could take every drawing that I've done and have it last for 2 frames rather than 1 frame. Okay, so I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to use my insert timeline frame. Insert timeline frame. Insert timeline frame. Okay. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm doubling up all of my drawings here. And so it's not that I've drawn more, but now they're all going to be held just a little bit longer, which is actually going to slow down the speed. So now when I play it, you can see it's not as fast as it was before. Okay. This process of taking your image and doubling it using frames, we would call this on the twos, which means you take every drawing and you just have it last for 2 frames as opposed to 1 frame. If you really want to stretch it, you can do on the threes, which means every drawing lasts for 3 frames as opposed to 1 frame. Okay. Finally, like I said, you can extend out the length of something using a frame. We don't always necessarily want all of our animations or all of our characters to start at the same time. So I have this woman, I have this dude, and I got this face. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this whole area. what I did is I clicked and I held down the shift key and I selected, and then I'm going to have it start on frame 10. Boom, like this. This is frame 10. Let's have the man. He's going to start on frame 20. Boom. And this is going to start on frame 30. Okay, let's take a look. Looking good. So now when I play it back, it should be woman, man, face. Woman, man, face. Okay. So at any point, you can always take whatever your character is and drag it. In fact, I could even, do something like this, where there's actually a dead zone in my animation. So if I come here, we play this, there's like a, half second, third of a second gap there before anything happens. Okay. So why don't you try that out? That was 3, 4, 5, and 6, please.